Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Just getting everybody into our virtual space today for this session. So my name is LaShanda Seaman. I'm an associate director at Ipsos, and I'm also leading on the communication and dissemination for this project. We'll be telling you a bit more about today. So this webinar is titled Exploring Creativity, Play and Democracy, Insights from a Scoping Review. And on the panel today, we've got two colleagues from the University of Birmingham. We've got Sonia Bussu and Susana Higueras. We've also got Temidayo Eseonu from University of Lancaster. We've got Marta Wojciechowska from King's College of London. And we've got Joao Amorim and Mariana Rosa from the Instituto de Ciencias in Lisbon. And we're really pleased to have all of them. They've been working really, really hard in terms of reflecting on the scoping review that's been taking place, looking at different sorts of creative methods in terms of participatory research. So some of you may be familiar with this project. It's a Horizon-funded piece of research called Inspire. And this piece of research is really focused on enhancing participatory and deliberative democracy, also PDD, as some people may be referring to it more colloquially, and really trying to see how we can address some of the criticisms of it being superficial and exclusionary is what this project is looking to do. So with this project, we've been trying to promote intersectional equality by creating more participatory spaces that are inclusive and prioritize the needs of marginalized communities, but also looking at seeing how the processes can be resilient to government changes and leverage existing grassroots efforts for community endurance. So there are three main ideas that come with this project. So we're looking at the political economy of participation, co-design, as well as assemblage theory. So the approach that is kind of underpinning all of this work is trying to foster stronger, more democratic participation by understanding and incorporating diverse forms and practices of engagement. And we'll be referring to a lot of those in the webinar today. We're looking at those arts-based methods. So work package 3, which is where a lot of the pilots are taking place, there's 7 different pilots, is where this scoping review happened. And the pilots have taken place in the UK, Ireland, Poland, Portugal, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Hungary. And before the pilots actually happened, the scoping review really took place, and it was about testing a range of different arts-based approaches across the different areas in which the pilots were happening. So my colleagues here that I introduced have been working hard in terms of not just doing the scoping review, but trying to see how some of the lessons from that, in terms of the methods that were used, could be applied to the processes that we were doing and other similar processes. So there may be lessons from here that you could be applied to your work if you work in the field as well. So today we'll be sharing some lessons from that. There'll be time for Q&A, and the recording will be available afterwards. Please feel free to drop any sort of questions and comments in the chat as we go through. We really want it to be interactive and not feel like it's sort of a lecture today. And thank you for joining all of us again.
Thank you all very much for joining today's webinar. My name is Susana Higueras, and I will be presenting the findings from a scoping review we conducted on arts-based and creative approaches for inclusive participation. This work was a collaborative effort with colleagues across several institutions, many of whom are here with us today. Our scoping review was guided by a central question: how can we use creativity, art, and play to make participatory and deliberative democracy more inclusive? By exploring different case studies from around the world where arts-based methods were used for participation, we wanted to first assess how effective these arts-based approaches were in fostering inclusive intersectional participation in policymaking. Second, we wanted to critically reflect on their opportunities and limitations through an intersectional lens. And last, we wanted to develop practical learnings to inform future participation process involving marginalized groups. So the 3 areas I will be focusing on this webinar will be the reasons why practitioners use these methods, the strategies they implemented, and some of the impacts these methods had on individuals, communities, and policymaking. We will end this webinar with some critical reflections and future directions of using these methods to make participatory and deliberative democracy more inclusive. So for our methodology, we followed FHEA Anomalies framework for conducting a scoping review, which consists on 5 steps, starting with a research question, followed by a database selection, identifying relevant studies, coding them, and then finally writing a report on the findings. We conducted this scoping review between May and August of 2024, and our inclusion criteria required studies that empirically addressed participatory processes understood in a broad sense, that employed creative arts-based methods, and finally, that involved the inclusion of marginalized groups as participants. We searched both academic literature using Web of Science, but also conducted a stakeholder consultation where we asked some colleagues to share case studies that we wouldn't have find in academic literature. And from nearly 200 papers, we identified 44 relevant sources that we then do a collaborative coding with NVivo, and we analyzed for this report. In the next slide, I will share some of the findings. So our scoping review revealed a variety of arts-based methods used in these processes. We were able to categorize all of these in 3 main families. First, we found visual methods, where photo voice was the most prominent one, but we also found drawing and mapping approaches. And these methods were particularly valuable because they helped transcend language barriers and educational differences. The second family of creative methods was performance-based methods, where theater was the most common, but we also identify approaches such as dance, music, role play, the use of games, and these methods emphasized embodied experience and were very powerful for exploring complex social issues. And finally, we found some narrative methods, which included both traditional and digital storytelling, poetry, and reflective writing. And these were very effective for centering personal narratives and lived experiences. It's important to notice that many of the case studies combined different elements from these families, and they used these methods as a complement to addressing different aspects of inclusion. A key finding of this, before moving to the rationale, it's important to notice that a key finding was that only 5 out of these 44 sources directly addressed arts-based approaches in formal democratic processes. Most of them focused on participatory action research or co-production processes. And this showed a significant gap in the literature and the need to explore the implications of these arts-based approaches for democratic theory and practice. So now, one of the first things that we wanted to understand understand in the literature was why were practitioners employing arts-based and creative methods in these participatory processes. First, for inclusion. These methods helped break down barriers that often prevent marginalized groups from participating in traditional research and policy making. They created alternative pathways for participation to communicate personal experience. They helped people move beyond verbal communication and helped participants to articulate some sensitive information and complex ideas. For example, in a case from South Africa, researchers used collage making and storytelling with university students to explore their experience of sexual violence on campus. So using this method helped participants to articulate this sensitive information that might have been difficult to share through other methods. Second, they used these methods for social justice. There was this expectation to promote both individual and collective well-being. So these methods were actually used as catalysts for collective action. And finally, a third reason was democratization, understanding democracy as an everyday practice rather than just a form of government. This was less explicit in the literature, but we did find some broader reflections on how advancing inclusion, equality, and social justice could strengthen feeling of belonging to a democratic community. But implementing these arts-based methods had their challenges, and they required some strategies for inclusion. As we can see in the image, the participants that were involved in these processes, they often navigated multiple and overlapping forms of marginalizations. So when examining how researchers engage with these identities and experiences, we found that some articles did recognize the complexities of intersectional identities in their groups, but there was a need for a deeper engagement in intersectional theory. But to create more inclusive spaces for these groups, the practitioners used several strategies. For example, they needed to create a safe and inclusive environment, and that required facilitators training that would go beyond technical skills. Practitioners mentioned the need to be aware of systematic social issues and the importance to pay attention to visible and hidden power dynamics in these processes. There's an example of a case study that we include where they worked with adolescents discussing sexual health, and researchers found that it was important to match facilitators and participants by gender and age to help create this safe environment for fostering this discussion. Cultural responsiveness was also very crucial. In one case study, researchers emphasize the importance of creating cultural humility that meant following communities' rules rather than imposing external frameworks. So while arts-based methods offered significant promises, there were also additional complexity and challenges that that practitioners needed to be aware of. There were some institutional barriers that were important. For example, questions about who owns and controls the outcomes of these processes. Many articles mention institutional constraints limiting the dissemination of participants' work. These methods also required a lot of resources, for example, time, skilled facilitators, and material resources, which make it difficult to implement in some contexts where funding was limited. Most important in our scoping review was to look at the ethical consideration and vulnerability concerns that appear during this process. Arts-based methods can create feelings of unease, especially when dealing with sensitive material. So, for example, visual methods like photography and film could expose participants and raised complex ethical issues around representation. One study of a theater project highlighted how there was some discomfort that arose during cross-racial casting that revealed some tensions within the group that was important to address in the process. Participants from marginalized groups could experience significant emotional labor when sharing personal stories through creative methods. In one case, researchers described how a participant, a trans woman of color, experienced burnout from constant pressure to share her stories and served as a role model. So it's important to bear in mind these challenges and not to avoid reproducing the same power dynamics that that they want to address in the first place. Additionally, there is a risk of tokenism when arts-based methods become formalities of inclusion without addressing underlying inequalities. So without a genuine commitment to change, these approaches could actually reinforce exclusion by creating an illusion of participation while maintaining existing power structures. But we did identify several positive impacts of using creative and arts-based methods in these processes. In terms of individuals, many articles mention the enjoyment of being part of these processes. They also mention personal growth, enhanced self-expression, confidence, and emotional processing. Participants developed improved communication and creative skills and experienced a sense of empowerment and increased agencies in their communities. For example, digital storytelling projects have allowed participants to gain skills in digital literacy, technology, film, and photography, as well as story development and communication. For communities, the impact including strengthening social cohesion, collective identities, and a sense of belonging. These processes fostered friendships, collective action, community resilience, and healing. And there was also a mention of intergenerational and intercultural understanding, promoting new networks and support systems. The impact on policy was less clear, but we did find some articles that showed how the consequences of these processes had effect on visibility and amplifying marginalized voices in public discourses. And some process led to local policy changes. And for example, there's an interesting case from Oklahoma City. This was a photo voice project with African-American women that led to concrete policy changes like the demolition of an abandoned building in response to community safety concerns that these women identified through their photographs. So in conclusion, why should we use arts-based methods in participatory processes? Our review found that these approaches served several multiple purposes across 3 dimensions. First, they enhance inclusion by opening alternative forms of expression beyond verbal communication. Methods like photo voice allowed participants to document their experience visually, transcending language barriers and making complex issues more accessible to diverse groups. Second, they disrupt traditional power dynamics by creating temporary spaces of equality where marginalized knowledge is centered. The use of play creates a sense of enjoyment while addressing serious issues, and that helped develop skills and confidence and enables participants to challenge expertise hierarchies through joyful and disruptive practices. And finally, they foster collective knowledge building that promotes epistemic justice by recognizing diverse ways of knowing. So this co-creation of understanding contributes to transformative learning and solidarity among participants, potentially fostering democratization through shared experience. So for our final reflection, and before we move to our conversation, there are some key issues to highlight. So there's limited experimentation with arts-based methods, particularly in participatory deliberative democracy. And through this scoping review, it's clear that it's important why we should experiment with these approaches. The centrality of fun and playfulness, it offers new pathways for engagement, but we must bear in mind the risks of replicating existing power dynamics if these methods are not implemented carefully and thoughtfully. There's also a danger in treating these creative methods as a panacea for complex social problems, so we need realistic expectation regarding direct policy impact. And finally, we found insufficient engagement with intersectionality theory in current practice. So now that we presented some of the key findings, we could have a conversation with the rest of the team regarding some of the issues that arose when doing this scoping review.
Yeah, thank you, Susie, for presenting the results of the scoping review. And I'll probably start from jumping off on the last statement that you made about sort of limited engagement with intersectionality theory and practice, and speak to sort of some of the, I guess, promise and challenges of operationalizing intersectionality and is arts-based methods, are they more kind of open to allowing this the praxis of intersectionality in democratic processes. So I think you highlighted, if I start with explaining intersectionality really briefly, and it's the idea sort of coming from Black feminist thought, where actually intersectionality is about thinking about whose experiences are being invisibilized, and also makes people more, or particular groups of people, starting kind of from Black women, more vulnerable to sort of power structures and systems of oppression, and then sort of that then spans out and has traveled to different kind of groups and demographics. And what arts-based methods, and sort of from the scoping review, what we were able to see quite interestingly was that actually things like people who are using it as arts-based methods usually have a keen sense or desire to disrupt power dynamics. They've got a social sort of change, justice element, transformational goal as part of the use of arts-based method, and particularly thinking about things like epistemic justice and ensuring different forms of knowledge, rather than just kind of verbal or dialogue based, and things like the self-expression, which I think really serves the purpose of highlighting these hidden experiences or invisible experiences. It really kind of allows participants in these processes to tell their stories in their own voices, to really kind of encourage that critical, it's all about kind of raising critical consciousness, thinking about how structures of inequality might impact on their own experiences, and then kind of showing that through some kind of aesthetic output. So I think that's really a core promise of arts-based methods for operationalizing intersectionality. And in terms of speaking more then to operationalizing intersectionality and what that actually means using arts-based methods is, it's a critical praxis, right? It's a critical praxis that really seeks to point out power dynamics, both kind of within the spaces of democratic processes, but also structural powers, right? And so I think that's kind of one of the key things. It's very much around who's most affected? How do we bring them not as individual or categories of identities, but actually as mutually constitutive people who then kind of can link their particular experiences to these kind of structures of domination that Patricia Hill Collins talks about. Krieger et al. Write about the importance of how to operationalize intersectionality through their they have a wheel, but the key things that they were talking about are things around learning, accountability, harm reduction, and kind of the transformative goals of intersectionality theory. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that actually, and I guess moving on to the challenges, is that it's still, even though there's this promise of arts-based methods in terms of operationalizing intersectionality, it is still not immune to the replication of power dynamics, thinking about who's interpreting these experiences, these artifacts that are being sort of produced through these processes. But I think if we can center sort of humility, which you already talked about, curiosity to learn about the different experiences, if we really think about accountability and, like being accountable to the participants who have gifted us with their knowledge, and being transparent about how we're interpreting that to reduce the harm in these arts-based processes, I think, there is that opportunity to decenter researchers and decenter kind of the more privileged groups who tend to take up space and air in sort of deliberative processes. So I'll stop there for now.
I couldn't agree more with Dayo's reflection, and thanks so much, Susie, for highlighting so beautifully the key findings of our scoping review. I think for me, one aspect where arts-based methods might help foster more intersectionally inclusive participation is in how they can really help center the lived experience of marginalized groups in non-extractive ways when facilitated well, as Susie explained earlier. So the scoping review highlighted how arts-based approaches are able to facilitate and nurture safe spaces where marginalized groups can build a collective political voice and then invite the wider community to engage with their own reality in all its complexity, which often has a very intersectional dimension. And so, but without turning them into victims, and in fact recognizing their agency. And so through the mediation of arts, participants can represent their collective experience of systemic oppression. And here an image, a picture, a line exchanged between two characters in a participatory theater, for instance, can really convey another's experience in a much more visual and immediate way. And these very human feelings of empathy and solidarity then become the shared space where very different people can start building a common language for change, but starting from experiences and realities that are often at the margins and silenced or ignored. So the scoping review really highlights how arts-based methods can enable embodied and sensory engagement, allowing participants to express complex emotion and experiences beyond verbal communication. And as Susie mentioned, how they promote epistemic justice by validating non-traditional forms of knowledge. And they do that by creating often very joyful and playful and but also culturally resonant spaces co-designed with the participants. And this can really help sustain engagement and also support collaborative knowledge co-creation, where the participants co-produce meanings as well as solutions. And this is, in my opinion, a very different way of including lived experience of marginalized groups for policy change. The way lived experience is often conceptualized in policy spaces can be quite tokenistic and even extractive. And I'm thinking beyond just democratic innovation, but also referring to co-production of public services or the various experts by experience panels. So this is a term, lived experience, that is increasingly invoked by researchers and policymakers, but there is limited understanding of how to incorporate lived experience into the democratic process in a way that genuinely validates it. And democratic innovations include a wide range of different processes, some more inclusive than others. There is always continuing experimentation, although never enough. But the way lived experience is conceptualized tends to be based on individuals sharing their stories as a testimony, often within contexts where the deliberation is framed, by no means always, right, but often framed by academic discourse and assumed expert knowledge. And so it can still be very powerful for those that listen, but it can also be extractive for the individuals invited to share these very personal stories in the first person, particularly if there is no follow-up and nothing changes. So one of the advantages of arts-based processes when, as Susie noticed, when they are facilitated well, is that they allow for lived experience to be co-constructed as a collective process of even playful exploration. So using images and art to, in a way, mask the individual story, but also universalize complex lived experience. And I think this can help build political agency through this process of conscientization, right? Following Paulo Freire and his work on emancipatory education. And so this collective lived experience of marginalized groups become the starting point of dialogue with the wider community and policymakers. So that means that marginalized voices become the protagonists rather than a side performance, and have the opportunity, the space to reframe the problem from their own collective experience of systemic oppression. So the wider community and policymakers have to engage with this perspective in order to co-create change. And in my opinion, only by centering the experience of marginalized group, we can aim as a society to foster genuine social justice. And so in this respect, arts-based approaches can provide important learning to rethink and enrich designs of many democratic innovation, to strengthen inclusion of diverse people and culture and voices that are marginalized, to genuinely center lived experience of marginalized groups as a collective and political act of resistance, to foster shared spaces based not just on talk, which can at times be exclusive of people that are not fluent in that language, that have learning or physical disabilities or lower education, and instead to create space for fun, emotions, feelings, as deeply human ways of sharing and communicating. And I think we often overlook the importance of emotion in democracy, and arts-based really put them at the center of democratic change. And I think Mariana and Joao have some great example of how they're actually applying some of these methods to work with people with disability in Lisbon.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia, so much for the small introduction. So the scoping review was very useful to understand the range of different adaptations that different practitioners had to implement in regards to arts-based methods, and in our case, more specifically, the applied theater methodologies. So as Sonia mentioned, we, in the Lisbon pilot, we're using the legislative theater to rethink inclusion policies for people with disabilities. And actually, our starting point of reflection on that methodology was that we don't want to turn this into a work meeting. And therefore, the performance will be sort of a middle ground between artistic creation and a traditional legislative theater methodology, if you will. We still don't know how it's going to work, but we're basically exploring different approaches to the legislative theater methodology. We do know that the performance will occur in an assembly format and that various types of media will be used, such as video, audio, and amongst others. And Joao will talk a little bit more about the challenges that we're having.
Yeah, so the scoping review was not only useful to think about possible adaptations to our work with the legislative theater with people with disabilities, but also and especially, I think, about potential challenges that may arise. So as Mariana was saying, we're still in a very initial phase of our process with the legislative theater, but we already had a few challenges. One of those was related to funding. So the performers themselves had to apply for grants given by higher arts institutions, which will inevitably condition the ways in which the legislative theater process will occur. So in scaling up to the National Theater, our original performance will have to take place in an open studio or in a rehearsal format, but we will have to do 2 performances in the same day because that was a precondition on our funding appliance. So that in and of itself will be a very difficult challenge to do 2 performances in one day, especially considering that we are working with people with disability. So the labor is much more intensive. A mere rehearsal is a much more dire process to a person with disability in comparison to a person without disability, of course. And of course, we have to take a lot of considerations to avoid tokenism, because we're working with a team of performers. The three of them have disability. So even with the employment of language, we have been discussing extensively the language we use in our day-to-day in talking with the performers and with the partners. For example, we are building a survey, and in this survey, one of the options stated people bearing disabilities. And that is a term that is not very accepted by people with disabilities, so we had to take it out. Also, discussions between saying motor disability or physical disability. So these very small details can have a big implication in the way that we construct our investigation. So yeah, the scoping review was obviously very, very useful to understand the wide range of not only adaptations, as Mariana was talking about, but also challenges that can occur. And now we are seeing them take place in practice. And I think that's it.
Great. Thank you so much. Really fascinating summary of the report. So my role is to provide some final points. Just wanted to mention, thanks to my colleagues, that the strength of the report is to demonstrate that arts-based methods are used and how they're used effectively. But obviously there are some challenges, as Susie has mentioned, and actually this will be my task to reflect on those challenges and to identify some venues or venue for future research. So I identified 3 risks of applying arts-based methods in participatory processes. The first one will be of overlooking power dynamics and political economy of participation connected to these methods. Arts-based methods in participatory spaces are not neutral or in principle positive or in principle more inclusive. As Susie has mentioned, they involve power dynamics and exclusion patterns, which themselves need to be considered. Connected also to this risk is some sort of my certain worry of understanding arts-based methods as some sort of blueprint, a tick box exercise that can be simply added to existing designs that exist in social or political world in a way that will be unreflective and ungenuine. So this risk creates a venue for future research. We need to be really much more reflective about how to employ them and how to employ in a way that emphasizes the agency with whom we work. We need practical examples of how to do it and certain common commitment for reflexivity. I also see the commitment to playfulness, which is open-ended and experimental, that have been mentioned before by both Susie and Sonia, as a tool of potential way in which arts-based method can be introduced in a genuine way. The second risk is connected a little bit to the first one, and also a lot of people during this webinar have mentioned it. The risk that the arts-based methods create new barriers to participation as opposed to decreasing them. The report mentions the challenges from funding constraints to emotional labor often overlap, intersect in complex ways, creating multi-layers barriers to participation and engagement. So obviously we need much more research. What kind of barriers? What sort of barriers fall on whom? Which sort of groups are precisely affected by the barriers created by the arts-based methods? Do they replicate existing injustices even further? In the longer term, we really need to know more about those barriers, simply to know how to avoid them. The final risk has been also mentioned both by Dayo, Susie, I think also a little bit by Sonia. There is a risk of overlooking the intersectional lenses. So I really want to come back to this understanding of intersectionality, which we use in the report, which is simply understanding as a tool for transformation, which I think is really, really an important one. While the report highlighted an engagement with the literature, with the intersectional lenses, and as Dayo has mentioned, awareness of those who employ these methods, we need much more research to know exactly how and whether and how they can be used for challenging power dynamics, even in a small scale. Sonia has mentioned that arts-based experiences can help by centering the experiences of marginalized groups, but we need much more research to see whether and how such centerings can be a tool of broader social transformation. So my final point is that the report highlights really important findings, which I hope will be and inspiring for both practitioners and further research. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, everybody. So that's our reflections there from the panel on the scoping review. I see there's lots of different questions in the comments there, and already some of them are being answered. So I wonder if there's any other additional questions that people had after listening to the reflections there from the panel.
While people are thinking about what to ask, I can answer one of the questions that I found really interesting in the chat, which is, well, Sonia already answered, but let me find it. There's so many. Okay, the arts language seems very far from politics and the bureaucracy is one. Have you noticed any clashes between these dimensions? Yes, not exactly on bureaucracy and arts, but we did. There was a couple of readings where researchers were working with indigenous communities, using and doing some arts, and there was all of these questions of how to translate the art into policy recommendations, and it was really interesting. We couldn't cover that in the presentation, but there was a lot of questions about representation and how to present this art in other terms, and if you're even able to translate that right into language that could be used for policy or for research. And there's also not necessarily about language, but there was also clashes in terms of wherever there were artistic outcomes, how could they share it? So who owns those artistic outcomes from these processes? If it was a process that some academics were working with a local government, and there was a case in Hong Kong where there was a photo voice process, and after that, the people who were involved in this process, they wanted to share this outcome, and the local government didn't want to share this because it wasn't a good image for them. So there were clashes also in terms of how to share these outcomes.
Thank you, Susana. It was the same problem we faced in the Democratic Odyssey, where we used arts-based methods, and we had to translate into recommendation understandable by bureaucrats and by decision makers in general, by politicians, and it was quite challenging to do this, to translate an arts-based work into maybe a language that is quite similar to the legislative one, that it's very far from the arts representation in general and from the outcomes of an arts-based process.
Can you give an example of the arts-based approach you used?
They're using in the Democratic Odyssey. Yeah,
Yes.
the playback theater, for example, in Athens, there was an actors company that asked participants about their emotions during the financial crisis in Greece or during the pandemics, and they literally whispered in the actors' ears their feelings, their emotions, and the actors acted the information they received by participants, and played, and they acted a kind of a play in front of the whole mini public of the Democratic Odyssey, and also the audience more in general. But we use the playback theater and also a more traditional representation of in Florence of the role of the Arno River in the history. We represented the history of the Florence Republic and also the venue was was a place fit for this purpose. We worked in the Salone dei Cinquecento at Palazzo Vecchio, so we could observe, we could watch at all the frescoes and comment on the history of the Republic, the Republic of Florence. So we were in a way all surrounded by art and discussed a lot about the relationship between art and policy recommendation in a nutshell. It was a process that was really based, I think, on arts. Also in Vienna, the last session of the Democratic Odyssey used very much, although I wasn't there, but they used very much arts-based methods. All across the old process.
Yeah. I think, in my opinion, it depends on what you're trying to do, because you might be using arts-based methods to open a discussion, reframe a problem, look at things from different perspective. That doesn't necessarily have to translate into a policy recommendation, right? So that for the legislative theatre I worked on with Katie Rubin and other expert facilitators, we had a clear policy focus that actually fed into a live policy agenda. And the way legislative theatre works is that after you see the representation of the young people, in this case, experience of accessing the labor market or work experience or career choices they face, after seeing that play that represents the experience, you then open to the audience and the policymakers to interact with those scenes. But the whole process is underpinned by a clear policy question. And so through this, then the play becomes the opener, right? The conversation starter for a deliberative dialogue that plays out very physically and interactively, right? Because the audience has to enter the play, create new characters, the young actors respond. That requires really skillful facilitation as well to keep the focus clear. But you do end up with actual policy ideas that can then be further refined and inform existing strategies or policy agenda. So it depends on what you're using the method for and how, but I don't think there is necessarily a barrier in terms of language. The barriers is in terms of the approach, and that applies to all participatory processes, right? Because there's always a difficulty in translating the citizens' input into actual policy change beyond barriers of bureaucratic language, more barriers of the way policy making happens, right? And so yeah, I take your point, but I think it depends on how you use these approaches. I don't think it's necessarily a limitation for arts-based methods only. I don't know if that answers your questions. I tried to give a few examples in the comment as well.
Yeah, no, probably I was thinking about mostly the Italian politicians and bureaucrats that are very formal, and while arts-based methods are informal ones, and you have to
It's a
Yeah,
process of culture change. Sometimes a policymaker turn up to one of these
yeah.
legislative theatre wearing a suit, and already, it gives a very different signal. But they learn, and then I think during the process, it's also an opportunity for them to really reconnect with very human
Yeah,
feelings, right?
yeah, and to unfreeze in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's also the way you challenge power dynamics and differential by using play and fun in a structured way.
yeah. Was it
Thank you. That's
the
really, really
topic?
helpful. I
Sorry.
think, sorry, just because of the time, I'm just gonna wrap up so people just keep dropping off. But I think it's definitely a conversation that can keep going, obviously through our different networks that we've got. But I just want to say thanks again to everybody for joining us today. Obviously, a really interesting conversation and something that can continue going. If you don't already, please do follow us on our different channels. We'll be sending out the links as well. There's lots going on with Inspire. We're only in year one. There's 2 more years to go. It's got our newsletter, our website, our different social media bits, and the recording of this will be shared on our YouTube so you can watch back and share with other colleagues who haven't been able to join as well. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon today. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Now, Stefano.